There's this chaotic balance. I know that's strange to say, but there's this chaotic balance because you're getting hit up with the hops right away. Bitterness, you've got this heavy dankness, uh, similar to cannabis and some other herbs and maybe a little fruitiness in there. And it's 8%, so it's no slouch. Um, so you're getting a little alcohol. The malts that they use bring that balance back around, and they're not throwing a ton of unmalted cereals in there. I don't know. It's just a drier beer compared to a lot of the other hazy IPAs.
That's Jason Ahlstrom describing one of the most influential beers in America, the Alchemist's Heady Topper, and the subject of today's episode of One Iconic Beer. John Kimmich started the Alchemist in 2003 with his wife Jen, and within months was making a beer that many people credit as the first hazy New England IPA. It's a funny thing about being first, though. As we'll hear in the interview, Kimmich is uneasy with this description. Heady Topper may have sparked a region-wide culture shift, but it doesn't really resemble the beers that followed it. Today we'll hear the story of Heady Topper, why its fans think it's so good, why it was the right beer at the right time, and how serendipity played a starring role in the form of a hurricane, a flood, and a new canning line. In addition to John Kimmich, we'll hear from Jason Ahlstrom, one of the co-founders of Boston-based Beer Advocate. In the early days of the internet, the site became a nexus of discussion and organization and helped create the excitement that led to, among other things, the haze craze that would engulf New England. We'll also hear from Andy Crouch, publisher of All About Beer magazine and a writer who has covered the New England beer scene since moving there in the early 2000s. This podcast is hosted by All About Beer and myself, Jeff Allworth. I'm a writer and the author of books like The Beer Bible and The Secrets of Master Brewers. All About Beer magazine was founded nearly 50 years ago and is the most comprehensive source of beer information on the internet. Go to allaboutbeer.com and find more podcasts, beer news, and a trove of insight and opinion. But first, a word about our important partners who make this podcast possible.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by RAR BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brew house, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, RAR BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great, or even iconic, pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. RAR BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.
If you stop into most breweries and nearly any bar or restaurant in New England today, you're going to find IPA on the menu, and it will almost certainly be hazy. This has given New England one of the most distinctive beer cultures in the U.S. It wasn't always like this, though. In fact, until about 15 years ago, most New Englanders had never really encountered a hoppy beer.
Yeah, very English forward. You had Gary's up in Portland, very English. You had Commonwealth Brewing Company. I already mentioned them. They did real ale. They had Yorkshire squares down the basement, fermenting just like an English brewery. Some of the best beer in the world. And yeah, not a lot was hop forward. Occasionally you would get a brew pub here and there that would want to try to brew something sort of West Coast or Pacific Northwest style, a hoppy red ale, if you were lucky. But yeah, it was all really malt forward, balanced, very drinkable. Occasionally you would run into a hoppy beer that was just crazy, like Catamount back in the day had a Christmas ale that was an IPA, and it sort of blew everybody's mind how hoppy it was.
So I moved to New England in 2000 after I finished law school, and I moved from the Midwest. At that point, I was living in Minnesota, and the beer scene in Minnesota was typically German, a lot of lager, and that was my background and was always the base of my love. And when I moved to New England, it was a really sharp transition beer wise. I moved here and every beer basically looked and tasted the same in a way that sort of presaged what the hazy IPA revolution would be, but in the absolute opposite direction. Everything here was influenced by England and English style beer. Every beer was essentially some hue of red or auburn. It tasted, they all had very old English style hops in them, if they were barely hopped at all. The styles were hard to sort of discern whether it was Ipswich original ale or all, Tremont's ales. All of these beers kind of tasted and looked the exact same. And you had some great standouts, Allagash White and others. And there were some great breweries like Willimantic in Connecticut that was making really hoppy, interesting IPAs, and it would have a dozen of them on at a time. But we had a lot of beers that tasted pretty much exactly the same.
This is the world John Kimmich entered when he arrived in Vermont in the mid-1990s. New England had an early cohort of craft breweries dating to the 1980s, and companies like Harpoon and Sam Adams were famous regionally or nationally. But among locals, the most respected brewery might have been Burlington's Vermont Pub and Brewery, founded by the legendary author and brewer Greg Noonan. It was the kind of place that might lure a young brewer from 600 miles away.
I was working in a homebrew shop in Pittsburgh, and I wanted to work for the best, and Greg was the best. So naively or overconfidently, I guess, I just packed my things and drove up to the Vermont Pub and Brewery and went in and asked for a job. And Nancy told me they didn't have any jobs. So I was like, oh, shit. So she said, but we just opened the Seven Barrel down in West Lebanon. Maybe they're hiring. So I literally got right back in my car and drove the 90 minutes in the opposite direction back and went to the Seven Barrel and met Greg for the first time. And so I walked in and got to sit down for an interview. I talked to the manager, or my friend Mick, and he said, hold on, Greg's here. And so we sat and talked, and I told him, I said, I have everything I own out in my car, and I am here for one reason only. It's to work for you and to learn how to make beer from you. I said, I'll take any job you got if you can help me achieve that. And he said, all right. And he gave me a job waiting tables. So I would wait tables 5 days a week, and I'd go in on my days off and work with the head brewer, the late, great Paul White. And that's where, for the first professional brews were at the Seven Barrel Brewery. And, after doing that for a year, I was ready to move on. I was thinking about moving out west. I was a snowboarder, and I just wanted to go and see where it led me. And that's when he offered me the head brewer job at the Vermont Pub and Brewery. And that was 1995, fall of 95. And it was very, very formative in the rest of my life.
The brewers of the founding era were pioneers in many ways. Andy Crouch describes the kind of people who became those first-gen brewers in New England.
What it was is these kind of like, gristled New Englanders who were hardy and strong and could do their own welding and do their own electrical work and all their plumbing, and that was, everyone I met was sort of in that mold, but they were all folks who had spent time in Europe and spent time in England, and that's where they really fell in love with it. And we also had, we had these Ringwood style systems, called these Peter Austin systems, that were, there was a gentleman who helped start Shipyard, named Alan in Maine, who had just created these systems up and down the East Coast, including, Ringwood was the original yeast that they used at Dogfish Head. And so this is just a beer, and it leaves a very, if you've ever had a Ringwood beer, you would know it because it is just it is butter and it is diacetyl, and this is considered very positive things for the people who love the system. And the tanks or in the brewing vessels are all clad in brick usually, and they're very distinctive looking. But this was the flavor of New England, and these were hardy folks who loved English style beer.
Greg Noonan was in many ways a quintessential first-gen brewer, hugely important in the history of the region. I wondered what John Kimmich learned from his time at Vermont Pub and Brewery.
Oh, Greg was the best. He was a really cool guy. We hit it off right away, and I've talked about this sadly at wakes and funerals of some of my peers. And I was recently talking at my friend Bill that passed away a couple of years ago, and he was great friends with Greg, and the two of them are the guys that are responsible for breweries and pubs being legal in Vermont. They were the guys that got the legislation put through. And what really struck me, and thinking about what I was going to say at Bill's wake, got me thinking about all that stuff. And it was the idea that I was 24, 25. And for the first time in my life, I was at a peer group. Like, I was having these amazing conversations with these adults that 30 years older than me. And it just really struck me. I remember it. And I remember what an impact these guys had on me, and just the fact that they took me in like that and all of that stuff. But Greg was just very down to earth. We both loved weed, so that certainly drew us together, and we both loved beer. And he was great. We had a ton of fun, and he taught me how to make great beer. But he didn't control me. He just told me what he thought great beer was and why other things weren't great. And as I developed as a brewer, I mean, he was spot on. And so much of that is so central to everything I do with the way I make beer. And Greg opened the Vermont Pub and Brewery, which is where I met my best friend and love of my life. So he's changed my life in countless ways. That was very early, and at the VPB, working under Greg and brewing his beers. And I took great pride in it because I knew I was doing a good job, because I saw the way he would light up when he would drink it. And I would watch him drinking at the bar, and I would see him like react and smell and taste things. And it got to the point, in the early days working for him, he was on top of me, every detail, watching what I was doing, talking, everything. And then he quickly saw that, all right, I don't need to, this guy's got it. And I took that as like, okay, well, I'm going to start playing around. And so I started upping the ante on beers that I was making down in his basement. And so, if he called for this many pounds of hops, I was doubling it and doing this and not telling him. And, but I'd see him drinking them and he was going nuts. And so he just kind of let me go.
In 2003, John and Jen founded The Alchemist. In its early days, at least, it didn't seem like the future side of a revolution.
I first visited there sometime in 2004-ish. And that's when they were really brewing a lot of Belgian style beer. They had just won a GABF a gold medal for their Sturk Wit, which was in the Belgian style strong ale category. And that was the beer that I really focused on and I wrote about. And Heady Topper, I think, probably existed at the pub in Waterbury, but I didn't even take that much note of it, frankly. In my notes here, their year-round beer at the time was something called Holy Cow IPA.
John Kimmich confirms Holy Cow was their first year-round IPA, but fairly soon, and way before the world would ever hear about it, he was also making a beer called Heady Topper.
Yeah, when I first started brewing Heady, it was just a couple of months after we had opened the Alchemist Pub and Brewery. So we opened that November 29th, 2003. I would guess that Heady Topper first appeared probably in January of 2004, within 6 to 8 weeks of opening. So, when Jen and I opened that pub, again, we didn't know what people were going to be into. We didn't know how they were going to receive the beers that I was brewing and was planning on serving. And so had a very thoughtful opening list. And, on there was Holy Cow IPA, which was, in terms of beer nowadays, of course, tame. But in those days, it was far from tame. But it was still had a foot in tradition. It was 5.2%, but it was hopped the way I wanted beers to be hopped. And I thought IPA should be tasting. And it was wildly popular. So immediately it was like within a week or two of opening, it was apparent. It was like, all right, I can do anything I want with hops and I'm going to have a market for it. It's not going to be a problem. So Heady Topper blossomed out of that right away. Obviously there were beers out there. Pliny was being brewed. The double IPA was just such a new thing at that point. But there were other breweries that I was I mean, I remember the summer before we opened the pub going out to California and getting to try some different beers that were very inspirational. And so when I got to make Heady, of course, it's different than what it is now, but not drastically so. A lot of techniques I've developed over the years. The way I treat beers, the way I treat the hops, all of those things have been refined over the years, but the core concept of that beer remains the same, which is a just a beautiful hop experience with a nice chewy malt body and just reeking of weed. I mean, that was the whole point behind Heady Topper from day one. So when we finally opened our own pub, that was the beautiful part about it was, I could just go for it. And, there wasn't there wasn't a lot of things to be inspired by because there weren't a ton of them out there. I mean, yeah, when I went to California, I was getting great IPAs, but they're California IPAs, they're amazing, but they're California IPA. And I didn't just want to make California IPA. And I knew I didn't want to make English IPA, what everybody called East Coast IPA.
Right.
So I just made it the way I wanted it. The haze just happened. It's not like I would brewed a beer to be a hazy IPA. I brewed the IPAs the way I wanted to use them, using the hops that I wanted to use in the quantities I wanted to use. And the beer was hazy. So be it, And again, those early years I have in the pub, we spent constantly educating people and fighting the misconception about hazy beer. I mean, you can look at those early beer advocate reviews of Heady Topper, and it's like 5, 5, 5, 5, 1 on appearance, like again and again and again. And it's just kind of laughable, but it didn't bother us. It was like, whatever. Who gives a shit what that guy thinks? I mean, it's delicious. So
On the West Coast, IPAs had become popular a decade before Kimmich founded The Alchemist, but New England still remained virgin territory for hops. Once breweries like The Alchemist and a few others began making IPAs, they created a sensation. One of the vectors of discussion was Beer Advocate, located in the center of the action. Here's Jason Ahlstrom.
I mean, we started doing festivals, as I mentioned, back in 2003, and in a way, we were drawing breweries to the New England area because they wouldn't just get the license to distribute in Massachusetts. They'd send out a couple pallets and hit up Connecticut round, the rest of the states if it was made sense to them. And so these beers were showing up. I believe Stone Brewing Company, we, sort of did a challenge with them and, told them if they come out, your beer's going to be popular. People will drink it. You had Boulder with their Mojo IPA. And when these beers hit the market, especially in Boston, everybody wanted a keg of it. Yeah, and that's sort of the West Coast or sometimes no coast hoppy IPAs. So the bitterness was there, the drinkability was there.
And what was going on? Talk a little bit about how Beer Advocate played a role in bringing people and these hoppy styles together? What were you seeing as hoppy styles were becoming popular in the region, a similar development on Beer Advocate?
Oh yeah, I mean you would have a brew pub out in I believe it's in Minnesota. I forget. I think it's Town Hall Brewery. They had a Masala Mama IPA. All of a sudden, that became number one on our top list. Problem is, you can only get it in growlers. So people were actually trading growlers. I don't know how that worked out, but uh, it's just one of those beers that just popped out of nowhere.
That trading culture was really important in the nexus between the styles getting popular, what they were reading about on Beer Advocate, and then trading beers. Will you talk about how that developed?
So when you did have your Treehouse and your Trillium, the Alchemist, when those guys popped up and started becoming popular, started making the top lists, there was talk of more trading of those beers. And then you would hear about some random guy on the side of the highway at a rest stop trying to sell those beers.
It did have the effect of increasing the visibility of these beers and these breweries, though, which I think helped popularize them at the time, yeah.
Oh yeah, you're making friends with people across the country. Um, you're sending beers back and forth. That's sort of your pen pal, your beer pal at the time, and it was great that these people had access to beers that they would not get at all unless they traveled.
The Alchemist had gotten on the radar of some beer fans, but it was still a small brewery in the northern reaches of New England. It's possible Heady Topper might never have been discovered, but nature interceded in the form of Hurricane Irene, which became a cyclone as it passed through Vermont.
I mean, when Irene hit, we were rocking at the pub. We were as busy as we could be. Quite literally couldn't be any busier from the moment we opened the door until the time we got the last person out the door. Couldn't have been any busier. You can't sell any more food. You can't, with good conscience, sell any more beer. So, it was that last year that Jen, she was the driving force in moving forward with a production brewery. It was bonkers. We had a little kid, we had our son, and so busy. And the idea of then having a packaging brewery was made my head spin. But she saw the value in it. She saw that we needed to do that. We had too much to offer, and the pub was a constraint. So we started planning that production brewery. And the idea was that we were going to make, I made about 400 for for a number of years. I used to nail my production exactly on 420 barrels just for the fun of it. But that's what we make a year, you know, 420 barrels a year. So when we were talking about opening a production brewery with an opening capacity of 1,500 barrels a year, it's like, holy shit, that's a lot of beer. Like, are we going to be able to sell that much beer? Like, that's a lot of beer. How are we going to sell that beer? So we thought, oh, we'll sell it at the pub, you know? We'll just sell it at the pub, which so preposterous. So the flood hit the Sunday night, and Tuesday morning was our first canning run ever of Heady Topper. So the timing of it was impeccable because we might have just been driven out of business if we hadn't had that production brewery ready to go. And it was late. We were a couple months behind schedule. So even more so, we had thought we were going to be brewing 2 months earlier, but we weren't. So that plays into the impeccable timing of it. If you can use a word like that, I don't know what you'd use because it was just the biggest gut punch ever. So here we are, that first canning run, and Jen comes down. she's at the production brewery overseeing that. I'm down at the pub, waist deep in fuel and shit and sewage, pumping out the basement. And she comes down with our very first can ever of Heady, and we stand there, we chug it together, we each have half a beer, and she goes, okay, bye, and off she goes, So all of the timing of that, here it was, we got financially ruined in that flood, but just like that, we had the income stream, thankfully, from the production brewery. So every penny that came in was immediately put into new equipment. Within about 3 months of opening, we doubled our production with 4 more fermenters and another conditioning tank. And then it took us about 6 more months to go from 3,000 to 6,000. And then it took us about another 9 months after that to go from 6,000 to 9,000.
From the brewery's perspective, a canning line allowed for greater distribution and growth. In hop-free New England, that distribution meant more people discovering the joys of IPAs. One overlooked factor was the package. Jason, Andy, and John all make this connection.
A couple aspects to it. I think one is the packaging format as well. I believe they're one of the first breweries to do the 4-pack tall boy packaging, and that definitely threw the industry for a loop. They're like, oh, we're not doing bombers anymore. The format really helped something new, because I believe at that time people were sort of bored of bombers. The pricing wasn't good either. And to be able to walk away with a 4-pack of tall boys, of this delicious bitter, it's a bitter beer, double IPA, little haze to it. Very exciting. It's very exciting. And to have all these other breweries follow with that format, it's pretty amazing.
And it was lucky they did with the timing, because that flood came in and destroyed that basement brewery. And it was when those cans of Heady Topper started rolling out that's when people started chasing delivery trucks and showing up at the brewery, and the beers would, be something that even to this day people sort of smuggle around New England, and they hear that you have a can of Heady, and even the most jaded beer nerds, their heads turn. So Heady was one of the first ones that I can remember, if it wasn't the progenitor of all of this.
For the first time ever, people were able to take my beer away. Correct. The moment that people could take it in cans, it really exploded. That was like gasoline on the building craze, for sure. I said before, Heady, I wanted it to be the ultimate satisfying one beer, liquid weed, just the sweet spot on the alcohol. It just gives you that one can buzz. It's just beautiful. So that's what Heady Topper always was intended to be. The fact that it's in the can, and that is very intentional on the part of me and Jen. Of course, we chose a can because recyclable. First and foremost, it keeps 100% of UV light from destroying Heady Topper. It's the most common of containers. It's the most blue collar way you can drink a beer, is that just grab a can of beer out of the fridge, pop it, and drink a can of beer. And that's what we wanted. We didn't want Heady Topper to be elevated onto some pedestal and elite. It's like, no, this is for the masses. This is for when you get out of work and you just want to have one kick-ass beer.
In 2011, almost all the beer was still packaged in a bottle. In New England, the beer was all clear. So here came Heady Topper in a 16-ounce can, sold in 4-packs, with a decidedly hazy cast. Had the brewery been trying to spark a viral hit, they couldn't have made better decisions. Of course, it wasn't just about the package. Heady Topper was a gigantic sensation because of how it tasted. A lot of things came together for that beer, but mostly people just loved it. Near the end of our interview, Jason Ahlstrom poured out a can of Heady Topper and gave me an impromptu review that captures the delight people experience.
Yeah, see, first sip, you're getting that dank, near cannabis flavor. And really, the head never dies on this beer. And, you can imagine the amount of hops that they put in it. It's like orange pith and cannabis off the aroma. It's that intense bitterness that draws me back because there's so many hazy IPAs that when you drink them, yeah, it's fun to have the big juicy beers, and then it sort of falls flat into this mouthfeel of oats in who knows what yeast proteins, um, that are not so agreeable on the palate. This beer is a little bit on the drier side, malty, very malty. So there's that balance there. Um, Extremely dangerous because it is drinkable and it is 8%. So I've had my share of Heady Toppers in Lake Champlain. Um, and I make sure I'm holding on to a pool noodle so I don't float away.
Floating away was, it turns out, part of the goal. John Kimmich picks up the story of Heady's allure.
And Jen and I came up with that name for that beer, sitting out on the front deck of our condo, watching the sunset over Mansfield, just hanging out after work, getting high, coming up with ideas, brainstorming. And the name came about first, because it was it's the mishmash of two different terms for great weed, it's headies, something's heady, stuff like that. And then the topper, the topper is the top cola off a cannabis plant. So Heady Topper as a name hit, and then it was like, oh my God, that's got to be a double IPA, And so immediately, like before it was ever brewed, that name came about and the concept came about, and people just gravitated toward it. So it was really reassuring. A big thing I like to tell is that one of our customers, up until Heady Topper, he was a screwdriver drinker. He'd come in and everyone's drinking beer, but he'd get screwdrivers. And until Heady Topper came along, and that was the one that when he had that, he was like, this is what I'm drinking now, And so when that was, because it wasn't on tap all the time, I'd only make it a couple times a year. And but then he was all over the IPAs, everything, and then he was a full-on craft beer guy after that. He kind of put the cocktails away, which is good. Yeah, I mean, the evolution of Heady over the years is, time and experience. A lot of it, hop selection is a perfect example. When I first started out, I'm buying spot hops. They don't know who the hell's the Alchemist. I'm getting the whatever they have. So over the years, all of a sudden, it was like, oh, the Alchemist. And then it's like, oh, the Alchemist, So we enjoy the benefit of that. And rightfully so, we earned it. So, we're at the top of that pecking order. So when hop selection comes in, I have an amazing connection with all of our hop suppliers. And again, that we don't take that for granted. We cherish these folks and what they do, and we take care of them and they take care of us. And so now when I get presented with my cuts at selection, I mean, dude, these are gorgeous. And at times I am turning down hops that people would flip for. So I get to craft my beers with just the best of the best. Same thing on the side of our barley, with Thomas Fawcett's and Sons, an amazing 8th generation family run business out of England. Shout out to Mungo. He's the 8th generation, Mungo Fawcett, and their barley is superb.
For the couple 3 years after Heady Topper's can release, knowledge of these new hazy IPAs were contained within New England, but word was getting out.
We started to hear tell of these hazy IPAs, and there wasn't really a name for them yet. And over the years, the nomenclature has changed, whether it's hazy IPA or New England IPA or New England style IPA. But back then, we just started hearing about these new aromas and these new textures and these new flavors, and it was polarizing even back then. And people were trying, the brewers I talked to had heard of them, but hadn't really seen them, and were trying to figure out how to brew with them.
Yeah, I mean that was sort of the pre hazy movement, especially with Hill Farmstead and the Alchemist. Um, and they these guys weren't brewing these beers to be hazy. They were just brewing great beer. And you have your sort of second wave or the first real big push of Treehouse and Trillium. Um, those guys definitely saw the popularity in it, and they brew excellent beer. And that sort of catapulted things even more to the point where it just spread like wildfire across the world.
Inevitably, once these hazy-ish IPAs started getting popular, they sparked imitators, and brewers went further and further into the murk. Not everyone loved that development.
One of the earliest things I ever was ever told about them and reported out, and I think it was over Twitter, was that brewers were using flour in their beer to try to get a haziness. It was just and I am not a technically adept brewing type, but all of this sounded wild to me. And as somebody who is a very strong style traditionalist, and especially when it comes to lager, I was against this from the earliest days. Did not like it one bit. But I would go into places, like Hill Farmstead in its earliest days, and the Alchemist, and you would start to see these beers get passed around.
It was it was the weirdest thing. Like I mentioned earlier, when people would just trash it for being hazy. Um, just like that, everyone wanted to mimic and copy what we were doing. There's tons of brewers coming through the pub. These guys were drinking it. They were coming in, they were tasting this, and they were seeing what we were doing there, and they were going and trying to replicate it. And most of them were going about it all the wrong way. Their first plan of attack is more, which I had done. I had done that 10 years earlier. I mean, you try it and you realize quickly, yuck, more is not always better. More is just more. So the next thing, people adding things to create the haze, flour, applesauce to throw pectin, like all this wonky bullshit, because again, everyone got it wrong. They were all trying to create a hazy IPA instead of trying to make an amazing IPA that happened to be hazy. So overnight, Heady Topper wasn't hazy enough. Everybody with an ego didn't want to get accused of mimicking Heady Topper, so they naturally would branch off to do their own things. And then it just spun out of control. I mean, where hazy IPA is today, none of my beers I would call hazy IPAs, even though almost every one of my IPAs is hazy, because it just totally morphed into these flabby, baby aspirin, Tumsy kind of soft, chalky finish, loaded with overripe fruit kind of character that flabby. Just you drink them, and that first sip, you're like, oh, right. Hey, that tastes really good. And then 3 seconds later, you're like, oh, wait, oh. And then it just falls apart almost. I mean, across the board, it's just depressing as hell when I go out and try beers. But, there's so many like that it just gets a little depressing.
In the history of American brewing, three major styles have shaped the craft beer era. First, pale ales made with American-grown Cascade hops, then the much more intense IPAs they inspired on the West Coast, and finally, New England's hazy IPAs made with modern, tropical American hops. We'll give Andy Crouch the floor to describe this last development and the role Heady Topper played in sparking it.
I think hazy IPA is very arguably the reason we have nearly 10,000 breweries in this country. That beer style was so accessible to folks who thought they didn't like bitterness, thought they didn't like craft beer, because it had all of those juicy fruit flavors, both in the character, in the mouth, and in the nose, but also had that smooth, we're talking about that flower. It wasn't just haze, but it was this sweeter flavor, the sweeter consistency. And hazy really runs the gamut. You can have drier versions, sweeter versions, much more expressively hopped versions, and there are great versions and there are a lot of terrible versions of this style. But here it really opened the doors for non-beer drinkers to come in, find a place at the table, and really love it. I think on the question that hasn't been asked, but I think it's also had very negative consequences for the craft beer industry. And I think it can be, I'm sort of been working on a column in my head for years now about, and one of my favorite conversation points with other beer writers is, did hazy IPA kill craft beer? And I think there's an argument to be made that it has. I think it has done something where I don't know how many brewers I have spoken to, in the hundreds over the last couple decades now, a decade and a half now, who, when I ask, do they like hazy IPA? Are they happy to brew the style? They say absolutely not. Almost universally, none of them like it. Some of them are interesting, like Chris Loring at Notch Brewing, who's not somebody you'd think would like this style, and I don't think necessarily does, but he found it very interesting from a technical perspective, how to achieve the various goals you're trying to achieve. But the brewers fairly uniformly for a long time there just publicly lamented the fact that they had to brew these styles, but it is what the public wanted. It is what, along with the increase in tap rooms, is what fueled that fire to get us to nearly 10,000 breweries. But then brewers kind of stopped innovating. They sort of coasted on the wave of hazy IPA. And when that crested and started to fall, they didn't really have an answer. They didn't have a suggestion for what's next. And for an industry that had innovated for so long, it has sort of been in this hazy IPA doldrums, since that has fallen. Now, with that said, there are plenty of brewers that are still doing great, and they're making a lot of hazy IPA. But I think the history of hazy IPA, the history of modern craft brewing in the last 15 to 20 years has to be told through the lens of hazy IPA, and it probably has to be, and that probably starts in the basement of the Alchemist. This is one of, if not the most iconic craft beer, out there. I think there's certainly an argument to be made that this is maybe the most important American craft beer ever made. Do I think it is the best, or do I love everything that has come in its wake? Not necessarily for me. Others certainly disagree, but you can't argue with the results, which has been a near, John and Jen and Sean Hill and a few others help redefine IPA as it is known in this world. And if you go into a bar nowadays, almost anywhere in this world, and you ask for an IPA, most likely it's going to look and smell like Heady.
My thanks to John Kimmich, Jason Ahlstrom, and Andy Crouch for joining us to tell this story. This show is produced by All About Beer and was edited by John Hall. Visit us online at allaboutbeer.com, where you'll find a trove of wonderful information about all things beery, and please follow us at All About Beer on social media. Our music was performed by Anastasia Chubarova, whom you can find on Pixabay. I'm Jeff Allworth. Thank you for joining me for this exploration of one iconic beer.
This episode of the One Iconic Beer podcast is supported by RAR BSG, trusted supplier to brewers, distillers, and beverage makers across North America. From the barley field to your brew house, we're proud to support the people behind great beer with the ingredients, expertise, and service they depend on. Whether you're brewing the next great American double IPA or crafting an award-winning continental lager, RAR BSG provides the industry's finest quality, selection, and support. Behind every great, or even iconic, pint, there is a partner who knows what it takes to make it happen. RAR BSG is proud to keep the beer flowing with you.
Tired of inconsistent fermentations and off flavors in your beer? It's time to strike back with Yeast Lightning Nutrient from Escarpment Labs. Unlike generic nutrients, Yeast Lightning is a balanced blend containing bioavailable zinc, magnesium, and B vitamins designed specifically for beer yeast. It's been proven to shorten fermentation times and improve final beer flavor. Plus, it helps you get more generations out of your yeast, saving you money on every batch. Whether it's a dry hopped IPA or a crisp lager, give your yeast the fuel that they actually need. Order your first pack today by emailing sales@escarpmentlabs.com. Mention the All About Beer podcast to get free shipping on your first order.